For 3 years, every person who walked into that room came out bleeding. The shelter staff had tried everything: behavioral specialists, calming protocols, slow introductions. Nothing worked. So they slid his food through a slot in the door and wrote a word on a laminated sign that they hung slightly crooked above the handle. Unreachable. What nobody knew, what nobody had stayed long enough to find out, was that Rook wasn't dangerous. He was in pain. This is the story of the woman who didn't leave. If you've ever felt like someone, human or animal, was written off too soon, stay with me. This one will change the way you see the word unreachable. Make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel is for. The shelter smelled the way all shelters do, a mixture of antiseptic, dry kibble, and something warmer underneath, something alive and persistent, like the collective breath of every creature that had ever waited within those walls for a second chance. It was not an unpleasant smell, not exactly. It was simply the smell of hoping. Cressida Vale had walked through that front door on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, when the trees along the main road in Millhaven, Vermont, had just begun their slow and spectacular surrender to autumn. The maples outside had gone orange and amber, their leaves drifting down in lazy spirals, catching the pale afternoon light before settling into the damp grass along the sidewalk. She had walked the 4 blocks from her house, as she often did when she needed to think, with her coat buttoned to the top and her hands tucked into her pockets, her boots making soft sounds against the wet pavement. She had not planned to stop at the shelter that day. Or perhaps she had, in the quiet, unspoken way that a person sometimes moves towards something they have been circling for a long time without admitting it. It had been 14 months since her daughter had moved to Portland. 11 months since her sister had retired and relocated to Florida. And 7 months since Cressida had finally acknowledged, in the honest and unforgiving way that early mornings demand, that the house on Birchwood Lane had become very quiet. She was 63 years old. She was not unhappy. But she had begun to notice the absence of small sounds, the creak of someone else moving through the hallway, the sound of another person setting a cup down on the kitchen counter, the distant murmur of a television in another room. Little sounds that a person rarely thinks about until they are gone. A cat, she had thought. Maybe a cat. The woman at the front desk had been friendly and efficient, with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and a name tag that said Helen. She had walked Cressida through the main adoption room, where a dozen cats lounged in various states of relaxation, some pressing their faces against the glass of their enclosures, others sleeping with the total commitment that only cats seem to fully achieve. A tortoiseshell. 2 tabby brothers. A round orange Tom who yawned magnificently as Cressida passed. She had looked at all of them. She had felt a warmth for all of them. And then she had noticed the hallway. It was narrower than the main corridor, lit by a single overhead light that hummed faintly, and it led toward a reinforced door at the far end. The door had a small window of scratched, cloudy glass, and affixed to it was a laminated sign, slightly crooked, that read, "Do not enter without staff present." "What's down there?" Cressida had asked. Helen had hesitated. "Not long. Just enough." "That's Rook's room," she said. The name hung in the air between them the way certain names do, carrying more weight than the single syllable suggested. Cressida turned to look at her. "Who is Rook?" Helen set down the clipboard she had been holding and folded her hands with the careful precision of someone choosing words deliberately. She explained that Rook was a gray cat, approximately 5 years old by the veterinarian's best estimate, who had been brought to the Millhaven Animal Shelter 2 years and 9 months ago. She explained that he had arrived with no background information, no owner records, no microchip. She explained that from the first week, he had shown what the staff diplomatically called reactive behavior. Reactive meaning what, exactly? Cressida asked. Meaning that every person who has entered that room has come out with at least one scratch, Helen said quietly. Some of the volunteers have come out with worse. We've had a behaviorist in twice. We've tried slow introduction protocols, calming sprays, different approaches. Nothing has changed the pattern. She paused. He's been in that room for nearly 3 years, and no one has been able to get close to him. We feed him through a slot in the door. He's healthy. But he's... She searched for the right word. Unreachable. Cressida looked down the hallway toward the scratched glass of the door. She could not see much through it. Just a dim room. And in the far corner, the faint gray shape of a cat sitting perfectly still. "I'd like to see him," she said. Helen's expression shifted. It was the look of a person who has said a version of the same thing many times and is preparing to say it again. "Miss Vale, I really do need to advise against that. We have a liability." "I understand," Cressida said. "I'm not asking you to let me in. I'm asking to stand at that window for a moment." Helen considered this. Then she walked with Cressida to the end of the hallway. Through the scratched glass, the room was dim and cool-looking. The floor was bare except for a water bowl, a food dish, a low shelf with a folded blanket, and a cardboard scratcher that had been used down to nearly nothing. Rook sat in the far corner. He was gray, a deep, even gray, the color of a winter sky just before snow, with eyes that were a striking pale amber. He was not pacing. He was not restless. He sat with his paws folded beneath his chest and his gaze fixed directly on the small window, as though he had been aware of Cressida's approach long before she arrived. He was watching her. Not with the wide, unfocused look of an anxious animal. With attention. With something that, in a person, might have been called assessment. Cressida stood there for a long moment, her hand resting against the door frame. "What did you say his name was?" she asked, though she already knew. "Rook," Helen said. And from behind the reinforced door, though it was impossible to say exactly why, the gray cat in the corner shifted his weight, just slightly, as though the sound of the word had reached him through all that distance. Cressida drove home that evening with the image of those pale amber eyes in her mind, steady and serious and waiting, and she thought about what it might mean to wait in one place for 3 years without anyone understanding why. She came back the next morning. The sky over Millhaven was the color of old pewter, and the air carried the particular cold clarity that arrives in Vermont in October, like a familiar neighbor, expected, known, and still somehow startling in its sharpness. Cressida had brought a thermos of tea, which she carried in one hand, and she had worn her old green wool coat, the heavy one with the deep pockets, the one she had owned for 20 years and that had absorbed, over time, the soft smells of wood smoke and cedar from her linen closet. Helen had been waiting for her. That was not entirely true. Helen had been at her desk doing paperwork, but something in the slight widening of her eyes when Cressida walked through the door suggested that she had been expecting this, and that she was not entirely sure how to feel about it. "You came back," Helen said. "I told you I would," Cressida said, though she was fairly certain she had not, in fact, said that. She signed the standard visitor waiver, Helen insisted on it, and Cressida did not argue, and then she walked down the narrow hallway toward Rook's room. Helen followed at a careful distance, watching. This time, Cressida did not stop at the window. She put her hand on the door handle. "Miss Vale." Helen's voice was firm. She had the tone of a woman who had watched well-meaning people make poor decisions in that hallway many times and had developed a particular quality of authority to address it. "I cannot in good conscience allow you to go in there without full understanding of the risk. That cat has drawn blood from trained staff. He doesn't give warning. He simply reacts." "What kind of warning does he give?" Cressida asked. Helen blinked. "I just said, he doesn't give warning." "Everyone gives some kind of warning," Cressida said, not unkindly. "What does he do just before he reacts? Does his tail move? Do his ears go back? Does he make a sound?" Helen was quiet for a moment. It was the silence of someone realizing that in 3 years of careful documentation of Rook's reactions, no one had thought to look quite that closely at what came before them. "His ears go back," one of the younger staff members said from the end of the hallway. A young woman named Patrice, with braids and paint-stained sneakers, who had been pretending to sort supply boxes nearby. She looked slightly embarrassed to have spoken. And his left ear twitches. Just before. It always twitches. Cressida turned to look at her. "Thank you," she said. Then she opened the door. The room was cool and carried that layered smell she had noticed through the glass the previous day, antiseptic over something older, something that had settled into the walls and the floor like the memory of all the animals that had ever waited in that space. The light was dim. The folded blanket on the low shelf had been moved slightly since yesterday. The cardboard scratcher sat in a different position. Rook was in the far corner. He had not moved from where she had last seen him through the window, or at least he had returned to that spot, and now he sat watching her with those pale amber eyes, his body low, his paws drawn in beneath him. His tail was still. His ears were forward. He was not in the posture of aggression. He was in the posture of extreme, careful attention. Cressida did not approach. She lowered herself to the floor just inside the door, moving slowly, letting the soft sound of her coat settling around her fill the silence of the room. The concrete was cold through her trousers, but she did not mind. She had spent many hours of her life on cold floors, in the early years of her daughter's childhood, sitting beside a small bed during nightmares, being still when stillness was what was needed. She did not look directly at Rook. She angled her gaze toward the middle distance, the way she had once read was less threatening to animals, and she let her hands rest open in her lap. She said nothing. Outside, Helen stood in the hallway watching through the scratched glass, and behind her Patrice had abandoned any pretense of organizing boxes. For a long time, nothing happened. Rook sat in his corner. Cressida sat by the door. The room breathed around them in its cool, dim way. Then Rook's left ear twitched. Cressida noticed it. She did not move. She did not change the quality of her stillness or the direction of her gaze. She simply registered it, the way one registers the weather, as information, not as a problem to be solved. The ear twitched again. And then, slowly, something shifted in Rook's posture. The tightness around his shoulders eased by some small degree. Not much. Barely visible. But there. One paw came forward. He stopped. His tail flicked once. And then, with the deliberate gravity of a very serious creature making a very significant decision, Rook stood up. He stood for a moment at the far side of the room, 4 paws on the floor, watching her. Then he sat back down. But he was no longer in the corner. Behind the scratched glass, Helen put her hand over her mouth. Cressida stayed on that cold floor for 40 minutes. Rook did not come closer. He did not need to, that day. What had happened was already something none of them had seen before. When she finally rose, quietly and slowly, and let herself out of the room, Rook did not follow. He simply watched her go, and resumed his listening. "How did you do that?" Patrice whispered. "I didn't do anything," Cressida said, pulling her coat straight. "I just stayed." She finished her tea in the parking lot, standing beside her car in the October cold, and thought about that. About the act of staying. About how rarely it was treated as a skill, or a gift, or a thing of any particular value. About all the times in a life when staying, simply not leaving, turned out to be the most important thing a person could do. She went home, made soup, and thought about Rook all evening. She came back the next morning. October turned its pages slowly, and Cressida became a familiar presence in the narrow hallway of the Millhaven Animal Shelter. She came every morning, 6 days a week. She signed Helen's waiver without comment each time, which eventually led Helen to simply leave the form on the counter with a pen beside it. She brought her thermos. She wore the green coat, or on warmer days a soft burgundy sweater that had belonged to her late husband, Raymond, and that she had kept folded at the back of a drawer for 8 years before beginning to wear it again. She told no one this detail. It seemed private, the way certain forms of grief are private not because they are shameful but because they belong entirely to the person carrying them. In the first week, Rook came no closer than the middle of the room. But he watched her steadily, and the tightness in his posture slowly, incrementally, began to ease in her presence. In the second week, he began to wait. This was what Helen noticed first and mentioned to Cressida with a look of quiet bewilderment. "Before you arrive," Helen said one morning, "he moves to the side of the room nearest the door. Not directly at the door, but closer to it. As though he's positioning himself." She paused. "He never did that before." Cressida considered this. "He hears me coming," she said. "We've had other regulars," Helen said. "He never positioned for them." "Maybe he hears something specific," Cressida said, which was not really an explanation, but which seemed to satisfy them both in its quiet acknowledgement that some things simply were what they were. She began talking to him. Not in the bright, performative voice that people sometimes use with animals, the slightly raised pitch that signals effort more than connection. She spoke to him the way she spoke to herself when she was thinking through a problem, steadily, without pressure, in the tone of someone putting thoughts into words rather than words into a performance. She told him about the maple tree in her backyard, which had gone fully gold now and dropped its leaves in great rustling showers when the wind came through. She told him about the cardinals that visited her feeder, and about Raymond's old chair by the window which she had finally moved from its corner to face the garden, a change so small that no one visiting would have noticed it, but which had taken her 3 years to make. She told him about her daughter Sophie, who called every Sunday from Portland and always asked, in the careful way of adult children managing worry at a distance, whether Cressida was keeping herself busy. Rook listened. He always listened. That was the thing about him that Cressida had noticed from the very first afternoon. He was not an unfocused animal, not the kind whose attention drifted and returned. When she spoke, he was present in a way that was, she thought, genuinely unusual. His amber eyes remained fixed on her. His ears tracked her voice. She had the persistent and slightly disconcerting impression that he understood considerably more than he was letting on. 3 weeks into her visits, she experienced the first setback. It was a Thursday, and the shelter was busier than usual, a school group touring the main adoption room, voices echoing down the hallway, a door slamming somewhere in the back. Cressida had settled into her place on the floor of Rook's room, and he had moved to approximately 4 feet from her, which was closer than he had ever been, and she had felt the particular quiet thrill of that proximity, the awareness of trust being extended across a very small distance at great cost. Then someone in the hallway dropped something metal, a crate or a cart, it didn't matter, and the sound hit the room like a stone hitting still water. Rook was gone. Not physically. But everything that had been building over 3 weeks, the slow easing of that deep tension in his frame, the patient movement toward her, the quality of his stillness that had begun to feel like presence rather than wariness, all of it contracted in an instant. He was back in the corner, body pulled tight, breathing visibly quick, every muscle communicating the single clear message that the world was not safe and he had been foolish to forget it. Cressida sat very still. She did not lean toward him. Did not call his name. Did not try to reassure him with words that she suspected would mean nothing in that moment. She simply stayed where she was, on the cold floor, her hands in her lap, and let the room be what it needed to be. It took a long time for the tension to begin to ease. Longer than she expected. And when it did ease, it did not ease completely. There was a residue to it, a ghost of that alarm that remained in his posture for the rest of the visit, and when Cressida finally left that afternoon, she did so with the awareness that some ground had been lost, and that it would need to be slowly recovered. She thought, driving home through the gray afternoon, about the nature of trust. About how it does not build in a straight line. About how there are events, sounds, silences, unexpected losses, that can send a person right back to the beginning of something they thought they had moved past. She thought about the first winter after Raymond died, when she had believed herself to be managing quite well, and had then walked into the hardware store on a Saturday morning in January and found herself completely undone by the smell of the place, which was his smell, sawdust and machine oil, and had stood in the aisle for a full minute before she could compose herself enough to walk back out. Trust, she thought, was not a door you opened once. It was a door you opened over and over again, each time from a slightly different angle, and sometimes the wind pushed it shut before you got through, and you began again. She came back the next morning. November arrived in Millhaven with the serious intention of a season that means business. The trees had shed nearly everything by the first week, leaving their bare branches against a sky that had settled into the particular shade of pewter gray that Vermont wears from November through March like a familiar sweater. The cold was no longer the sharp, bright cold of October. It was a quieter cold, a pervasive one, the kind that gets into old houses through window frames and under doors and makes itself comfortable in corners. Cressida had begun bringing a small folded cushion to sit on in Rook's room, which Helen had looked at with a complex expression that contained, Cressida thought, equal parts relief that someone had finally thought of this and mild embarrassment that the shelter itself had not provided it sooner. In the 4 weeks since the setback of the dropped crate, Rook had gradually returned to the ground that had been lost, and then, quietly, surpassed it. He now settled himself approximately 2 feet from Cressida when she visited, close enough that she could hear the soft rhythm of his breathing, close enough to see the precise details of his face, the small white patch beneath his left ear that was only visible from certain angles, the way the gray of his coat shifted in different lights from a flat pewter to something almost blue. He had not yet allowed touch. She had not yet reached for him. This was, she had come to understand, the entire point. The reaching was not hers to do. She had watched enough of Rook's careful, considered movements across those weeks to recognize that he operated on a timeline that belonged entirely to him, and that the only way to honor it was to resist the very human impulse to help things along. Her daughter Sophie called one Sunday in early November and asked, with more directness than usual, what exactly she was doing at the shelter every day. Cressida considered how to answer. "I'm spending time with a cat," she said. "Is it a nice cat?" "He's a very serious cat." "Are you going to adopt him?" "I honestly don't know yet," Cressida said. "I think that depends on him more than on me." There was a pause on Sophie's end. "Mom. How long have you been going?" "About 6 weeks." Another pause. "Every day?" 6 days a week." The silence that followed was the silence of an adult child revising her understanding of her parents' emotional landscape. "Are you doing okay?" Sophie asked finally, with the particular gentleness that the question carries when it means something more specific than it says. "I think I am," Cressida said. "Actually, I think I'm doing quite well." It was true, and she had not entirely expected it to be. There was something about those mornings in that quiet room that had reoriented her in a way she could not precisely explain. It was not simply the company, though the company mattered. It was the quality of attention required, the necessity of being fully present, fully still, fully there, without the distracted noise of errands and emails and the small administrative demands of daily life. In that room, there was only the moment, and the animal in it, and whatever patience she was capable of bringing. She had begun sleeping better. She had started eating breakfast again, properly, sitting at the kitchen table instead of standing over the sink. Small things. But real ones. On the 15th of November, Rook walked up to her and sat down directly beside her left knee. He sat there for 11 minutes, she counted, later, in memory, without moving, without acknowledging the significance of what he had done, with the composure of someone who had simply decided it was time and saw no reason to make a production of it. Cressida looked straight ahead at the far wall. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been, she was aware of this, and she found it faintly funny, the way the body does not distinguish between kinds of joy. She did not reach for him. He sat beside her. After 11 minutes, he stood, stretched elaborately, walked back to his blanket, and curled up facing the wall. Cressida sat for another 20 minutes, alone in that room with the quiet pleasure of what had just happened, before she let herself out. The breakthrough came on a quiet afternoon in the 3rd week of November, when the sunlight arrived unexpectedly through the small high window of Rook's room and spread itself across the floor in a pale, wintry rectangle that moved slowly as the afternoon progressed. Rook had been sitting in his usual spot near Cressida, and the light caught him in a way that illuminated the fine detail of his coat, the individual hairs tipped silver, and he looked, for a moment, remarkably beautiful. He stood and walked directly toward her. No circling. No hesitation. Step by step, deliberate and considered, and he stopped in front of her and lowered his head. And pressed it gently against her hand. The weight of him was so much more real than she had imagined, solid and warm and present, and she held very still with her hand against his forehead, the soft fur under her palm, and she thought about all the morning she had sat on that cold floor and wondered whether this moment would come, and found that the wondering had been worth it, precisely because the moment itself was this. Then she moved her hand slowly along his back. And stopped. She had felt it before she understood what she was feeling, a subtle difference in the tissue along his left side, a faint asymmetry in the way he held himself under her hand, and then the very slight but unmistakable tension that moved through his body at a specific point along his spine, just behind the shoulder blade. She had felt something similar once before, long ago, in Raymond's shoulder, before the diagnosis. That involuntary tightening under the hand of someone you trust, when the body reveals something the face has learned to conceal. Rook's body tightened. Almost invisible. But there. You've been hurting, haven't you? She whispered. She kept her hand perfectly still. Rook remained where he was, and after a moment the tension eased again, and he leaned slightly into her hand with the deliberateness of a creature making a considered choice, and Cressida sat in the pale rectangle of November sunlight and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from paying close attention to something for a long time, that she had been completely wrong about the nature of the problem. That afternoon, she found Helen. There is something wrong with him, she said. Along his left side, behind the shoulder. He has an injury, or he did. He needs to be examined properly. Helen looked at her. We've had him examined. When he arrived, not properly. Not the way someone would examine him if they believed there was something specific to find. She held Helen's gaze. Every time anyone has ever touched him, it has hurt. That's why he reacts. Not aggression. Not distrust. Pain. The examination was conducted by Dr. Miriam Esterhazy, the shelter's consulting veterinarian, a small, precise woman in her 50s who had been examining animals for 30 years and who listened to Cressida's description of the moment with the attentiveness of a professional who has learned that the observations of careful non-experts are frequently the most useful information available. She arrived the following morning and spent 40 minutes with Rook, with Cressida present and sitting in her usual position on the floor, which had the effect, Dr. Esterhazy observed with something close to scientific interest, of keeping Rook's anxiety considerably lower than it would otherwise have been. What the examination revealed was this: an old injury to the musculature along Rook's left side, likely sustained at some point before his arrival at the shelter, possibly from a fall or a collision, which had healed improperly due to the absence of treatment. The result was a region of chronic sensitivity, not constant pain, but a deep discomfort that flared with pressure, the kind that would cause an entirely predictable reaction in any creature, human or animal, when an unexpected hand made contact with it. For 3 years, every person who had entered that room and attempted to touch Rook had, in all likelihood, triggered that pain. Every scratch he had given. Every reaction the staff had documented. Every specialist who had assessed him as reactive, as aggressive, as unreachable. He had been protecting the one place in his body that had never been allowed to heal. Dr. Esterhazy straightened and made several notes. She did not make a fuss about the revelation. She simply noted it in the practical way of someone for whom discovering the actual cause of a problem is the beginning of work rather than the end of a story. We can treat this, she said. Anti-inflammatories to start, carefully monitored. Gentle physiotherapy over time. The tissue can improve significantly with the right approach. Helen stood in the doorway and was very quiet for a moment. 3 years, she said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a person revising a very long understanding of a situation and finding the new version both simpler and considerably more heartbreaking than the old one. Patrice, who had once again found a reason to be nearby, pressed her hand briefly over her eyes and then looked elsewhere with great interest at a section of wall. Cressida looked at Rook, who was sitting beside her on the folded cushion, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. He was watching Dr. Esterhazy with calm amber eyes. Not frightened. Present. He wasn't pushing people away, Cressida said quietly. He was trying to stay safe. And no one understood, Helen said. No one waited long enough to understand, Cressida said. She did not say this with any particular judgment. She knew, by now, how hard it was to wait. How the desire to fix, to help, to intervene, ran so deep in people that the act of simply sitting still and allowing something to reveal itself at its own pace required a kind of active discipline that most circumstances did not reward or teach. Treatment began the following week. Dr. Esterhazy had been clear that the process would need to be gradual. Any sudden or aggressive intervention would set back the progress Cressida had made in terms of trust, and the trust was, at this point, the entire foundation of everything. So the medication was introduced carefully, in his food, without drama. The physiotherapy, gentle, specific pressure along the affected area, was something Cressida herself was taught to do, because by now she was the only person in whose hands Rook was fully willing to rest. She learned the movements from Dr. Esterhazy on a quiet Wednesday morning, practicing first on a rolled towel to get the pressure right. The older woman guided her hands with the patience of someone who has spent a career translating knowledge into touch, and Cressida had the sudden, sharp memory of her own mother teaching her to knead bread dough at the kitchen table in the house where she grew up, in a town 200 miles north of Millhaven, in a kitchen that smelled of yeast and warm wood. She had not thought of that kitchen in years. She thought of it now with the particular vividness of a memory that surfaces not because it has been summoned but because it belongs to the present moment in some essential way, because what she had learned at her mother's kitchen table and what she was learning at Dr. Esterhazy's instruction were the same thing, at their root. How to do something with your hands that the person receiving it can feel as care. The first time Cressida applied the physiotherapy to Rook's side, she did it slowly, monitoring the quality of his attention, watching for the left ear, reading every small signal his body offered. He sat very still. His breathing did not change. He watched her face. And then, after a long moment in which neither of them moved more than was necessary, something in the chronic brace of his left side, that tight, defended holding that had been there since before anyone in this shelter had known him, shifted. Not entirely. Not permanently, not that day. But enough. His left ear relaxed. His shoulder dropped by some small, unmeasurable degree. He exhaled. Cressida kept her hands steady and felt, under her palms, the beginning of something that had never had the chance to begin before. In the weeks that followed, the change in Rook was gradual and then, suddenly, remarkable. He began to move differently. Where before his movements had carried that tight, self-protective quality, the held-in posture of a creature that has learned to minimize the territory his body occupies in the world, he now moved with more ease, more range, as though he was rediscovering the dimensions of himself. He stretched more. He explored the corners of his room with what could only be described as interest. He slept on his left side, which Helen noted with quiet triumph, because in 3 years he had never slept on his left side. And every morning, before Cressida's footsteps sounded at the end of the hallway, Rook was already positioned near the door. Listening. Waiting. There was a morning in early December when Cressida arrived to find Patrice standing at the end of the hallway with her arms crossed and an expression that she was trying very hard to make look neutral. "He meowed this morning," Patrice said. Cressida stopped. "He made a sound." "I've worked here for 2 years," Patrice said. "I have never once heard that cat make any sound. This morning he made a sound at me through the door." She paused. It was very small. But it was definitely a sound. Cressida thought about this all the way down the hallway. She thought about the difference between silence chosen out of fear and silence chosen out of self-sufficiency, and how difficult it was to tell them apart from the outside, and how only one of them was truly quiet. She opened the door. Rook was waiting. He walked directly to her, bumped his head firmly against her hand, and then sat down with the expression of a cat who has conducted a lengthy and complex negotiation to a satisfactory conclusion and sees no further need to discuss it. Cressida sat down on her cushion, pulled her coat around her, and laughed, a quiet, genuine laugh, the kind that comes from the middle of the chest rather than the surface of the face, the kind that has some relief in it. "You," she said, "are the most difficult and most extraordinary creature I have ever met." Rook blinked slowly. This, in the language of cats, is an expression of trust so complete it constitutes a kind of declaration. Cressida blinked back. Outside in the hallway, completely invisible and making no sound at all, Patrice was crying. The adoption paperwork was completed on a Friday in mid-December, 10 weeks after Cressida Vale had first walked through the front door of the Millhaven Animal Shelter with rain still clinging to her coat and no definite plan. Helen processed the forms with an efficiency that could not entirely conceal the emotion behind it. Patrice had brought a small cake from the bakery on Elm Street, vanilla with white frosting, because Patrice said she had been fairly certain this day would eventually come and had mentally planned it for weeks. 2 of the other staff members appeared with suspicious casualness in the front office, finding small tasks to occupy their hands while the paperwork was completed. Rook, in his room at the end of the hallway, was observed through the scratched glass to be sitting in a posture that was, by any reasonable measure, composed. "Are you nervous?" Helen asked, pausing over the forms. "About what?" Cressida said. "Taking him home. It's a new environment. It might set things back." Cressida thought about this. She thought about the nature of trust, and of recovery, and of the way that real change, the deep kind, the kind that has been arrived at slowly and honestly, does not simply evaporate in the face of the unexpected. It bends. It flexes. It accommodates. It is not the same as fragility. "I think we'll manage," she said. The carrier was a soft-sided one, a good one, chosen carefully. Cressida had set it in Rook's room 2 days earlier with the door propped open, so that he could investigate it at his own pace and on his own terms, which he had done with deliberate thoroughness, sniffing every corner, testing the soft walls, sitting inside it for a full afternoon before apparently deciding it met his requirements. The drive home took 7 minutes. Rook was quiet in the carrier on the back seat. He was alert but not distressed, watching out through the mesh front with his characteristic focused attention, cataloging his new information about the world. At one point, at a red light, Cressida reached back and rested her fingers against the mesh, and Rook pressed his nose briefly against them. The house on Birchwood Lane was a 1960s colonial with a deep front porch, a maple tree in the backyard that was now bare and bone-white in the winter light and a kitchen that smelled, on baking days, of the vanilla and cinnamon Cressida used in her grandmother's pie recipe. It was a house that had held many years of a life, raising a daughter, losing a husband, living on, which is its own kind of courage, and it had been quiet for a long time. She set the carrier down in the front hallway and opened the door without ceremony. Rook sat in the carrier for a long moment. Then he stepped out. He moved through the front hall slowly, methodically, lowering his head to the baseboards, examining the leg of the hall table, pausing to look up the staircase with an air of serious evaluation. He moved into the living room, assessed the sofa, crossed to the window that looked out onto the porch, and sat for a considerable time looking at the bare maple tree in the backyard. Then he turned and looked at Cressida. She was sitting in Raymond's chair by the window, the chair she had finally moved, 3 months ago, to face the garden, and she was watching him with her hands folded in her lap, making no demands, presenting no requirements, simply being present in the space. Rook crossed the room, stepped up onto the footstool, and settled himself 4 inches from her knee. Not on her lap. Not yet. But close. Present. She exhaled. "Well," she said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Raymond, or perhaps just to the room itself, which had heard many conversations over many years and received them all with the same patient, holding quiet. "Welcome home." The first week was not without its challenges. A loud car in the street sent Rook beneath the bed on Tuesday evening, where he remained for 2 hours before emerging with the composure of someone who had decided, upon reflection, that the incident had been beneath his dignity to mention. A workman's van parked across the street on Thursday had the same effect as the dropped crate at the shelter, and Cressida simply sat on the hallway floor and waited, reading a novel, until the sound of Rook's cautious descent from the spare bedroom told her things were returning to normal. He continued his physiotherapy. Dr. Esterhazy made a home visit in the second week, which Rook received with moderate suspicion but no drama, and she reported that the tissue response was improving significantly and that within a few months she expected his range of movement to be fully restored. "He's a different cat," she said, watching him navigate the kitchen with deliberate ease. "He's the same cat," Cressida said. "He just doesn't hurt as much." Sophie came to visit in January, having booked her flight in December with the particular mix of maternal anxiety and curiosity that the situation seemed to warrant in her. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon, stamping snow from her boots in the front hall, and stopped when she saw Rook sitting at the top of the staircase, watching her arrival with amber eyes. "Oh," Sophie said. "That's Rook," Cressida said. "You weren't kidding about Sirius." "I never kid about Sirius." Sophie spent the weekend, and by Sunday morning Rook had consented to sit at the far end of the sofa while she and Cressida drank their coffee, which Sophie reported to her friends afterward as one of the more meaningful endorsements she had ever received. By February, Rook had established the routines that would define his life in the house on Birchwood Lane. He slept at the foot of Cressida's bed, positioned with the precise geometry of a cat who has decided exactly how much space to take up and is not interested in negotiating it. He waited in the front hall every morning while she made tea, not demanding anything, simply present. He followed her from room to room in the afternoons with the unhurried dedication of a creature who has found where he wants to be and has absolutely no interest in being anywhere else. He loved the window seat that looked over the backyard. He spent hours there in the pale winter light, watching the cardinals at the feeder, his tail moving in slow, thoughtful arcs. Sometimes, watching him from across the room, Cressida had the impression that he was cataloguing the birds the way he had catalogued everything when he first arrived, with the focused, patient attention of a creature for whom the world was always worth understanding, if only someone would give him the time. She thought about his 3 years in that room. About the nights he had spent in that dim space behind the reinforced door, with the antiseptic smell and the worn cardboard scratcher, waiting without knowing exactly what he was waiting for. About the pain that had never been found because no one had known to look for it in quite the right way, and about how many things, in the lives of animals, and in the lives of people, went unaddressed not out of cruelty but simply out of the very human failure to sit still long enough to understand what was actually happening. She thought about Raymond, who had spent the last year of his life being patient about pain in a way that still, 8 years later, caught her by the throat at unexpected moments. About her sister, who had needed to move somewhere warm and uncomplicated after a life that had been neither. About Sophie, calling every Sunday with her careful questions, trying to determine from 2,000 miles away whether her mother was truly all right. And she thought about herself, about the woman who had walked into that shelter on a rainy Tuesday in October with no definite plan, and who had somehow known, in the way that the heart sometimes knows things before the mind has gotten around to understanding them, that the gray cat behind the reinforced door was not a problem to be solved. He was a story waiting for someone to stay still long enough to hear it. Spring came to Millhaven the way it always does, tentatively, then all at once. The maple in the backyard put out its first leaves in pale, tentative green, and the cardinals were joined at the feeder by new visitors, a pair of mourning doves, a chickadee who appeared to have no fear of anything, a red-winged blackbird who arrived and departed like a small, vivid announcement. Rook watched them all from his window seat with a connoisseur's attention. One morning in April, Cressida came downstairs to find him sitting in the kitchen, in a pool of early morning light, engaged in what appeared to be a detailed examination of the dust motes moving in the sunshine. He looked up when she came in, blinked slowly, and then went back to his contemplation. She made her tea. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table, where she had begun to eat breakfast properly again, sitting down, without the radio on, in the good morning quiet. Outside, the first real warmth of spring was arriving in the yard, and through the window she could see the maple's new leaves moving in a gentle wind. Rook stood, stretched with the full theatrical commitment that he now brought to every stretch, walked across the table, and stepped directly into her lap. He turned twice, settled, tucked his paws under his chest, and closed his eyes. She put her hand on his back and felt, under her palm, the warmth and ease and weight of him, no tension, no held-in guarding, just a cat at rest in the place where he had decided to be. She thought about the word unreachable. About the laminated sign on the door. About the 3 years and the silence and the scratched glass and all the people who had walked away. And she thought, what a different word patience is, when you practice it long enough to see what it was for. Outside the window, the maple was green, and the morning was full of ordinary sounds, the birds, the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower starting up for the first season, a dog barking somewhere on the next street, the small and irreplaceable music of a world going about its business. Rook slept in Cressida's lap in the April sunshine, and she sat with her tea and watched the light move through the kitchen in that slow, golden way it does in spring mornings when there is nowhere urgent to be and nothing more important than this. The shelter on Millard Street was still there, as it always was, with its smell of antiseptic and dry kibble and living hope, and the room at the end of the narrow hallway had been given a new coat of paint and a better cushion and a large window shelf for the cat who currently occupied it, a young tabby named Cecil who had, according to Patrice in her texts to Cressida, shown a very cautious but genuine interest in sitting near the door when certain people spoke softly outside it. Cressida had advised patience. Patrice had replied with a single sentence, learning from the best. Some lessons are like that, they do not stay where they begin. They move outward, carried in the hands of people who have learned, through long practice, that the most powerful thing they can offer another creature, human or animal, is not expertise or intervention or a well-meaning reach towards something it cannot yet bear to accept. It is simply this, the willingness to stay. To sit on a cold floor, in a quiet room, in a season that feels like it will never change, and to wait, not passively, not indifferently, but with the full and patient attention of someone who has decided that understanding matters more than speed, and that what looks like anger or wildness or damage beyond repair is sometimes, underneath it all, just something that has never been properly heard. Because the cat waiting in the room at the end of the hall is not unreachable. He is waiting for someone who will not leave. And sometimes, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, with rain on a coat and no particular plan, in a shelter in a small town in Vermont, that someone arrives. And everything, slowly, begins to change.